Georgia's Secretary of State on January 2nd and told him to, quote, find 11,780 votes. We survived that crisis because the Georgia Secretary of State refused to lie about the vote count and change the vote count so that Donald Trump could win the state of Georgia instead of Joe Biden. Republicans in Georgia do not want that to happen again. And so they have removed the Secretary of State from the position of authority in the aftermath of an election, and they have moved Georgia closer to the possibility of cheating the vote count next time Donald Trump calls and asks them to do that. And Georgia is not the only state that is trying to make it easier for Donald Trump to call and tell them how many votes he needs to win an election. Our first guest tonight, Ari Berman, has studied the new election laws passed by Republican state legislatures this year and says, quote, these bills are part of the greatest assault on voting rights since the end of Reconstruction, and they raise the likelihood of a nightmare scenario where GOP-controlled state legislatures use their increased power to override a Democratic victory in 2024 or persuade Republicans in Congress, if they regain power in 2022, to do the same. Republicans are trying to make it more difficult to vote in areas where Democratic turnout is strong. Democrats have fought that kind of voter suppression in the past, but they have never had to fight Republican attempts to change what happens after people vote. The Washington Post calls that the most dangerous thing that Republican legislatures are doing now. The Washington Post reports potentially most dangerous legislatures are giving themselves the right to interfere in vote counting and election disputes while tying the hands of secretaries of state to rule impartially, or even in some cases to seek legal advice. Bills giving legislators more oversight of elections, allowing them to interfere in the running of elections, and otherwise injecting partisanship into the process already have passed in Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas. This is the most important story about American government in our lifetimes. Republicans are trying to change the nature of government in America. They are trying to eliminate democracy in states where they fear accurate vote counts. A new report from 3 voting rights groups warns, quote, the commitment of many state legislatures to attacking the foundations of our democracy appears to have deepened. The trend toward threatening election administrators with criminal penalties is more pronounced and aggressive, and attempts by legislatures to perform core election functions has grown more brazen. Many election officials around the country have faced death threats. An email sent to election officials in Georgia said, quote, no one at these places will be spared unless and until Trump is guaranteed to be POTUS again. Many election officials are quitting their now dangerous jobs. The Associated Press reports it is clear that many have recently left because of the newfound partisan rancor around the jobs and the threats many local election workers faced leading up to the November election and afterward, as former President Donald Trump and his allies challenged the results. Many of the people seeking those jobs now do not believe in democracy. The Associated Press reports the local election jobs are being vacated as Trump's false claims of fraud persist within the GOP and provide a platform for his loyalists to launch campaigns to become top election officials in several swing states. That report from voting rights groups says the 2021 state legislative season may ultimately prove to be a turning point in the history of America's democracy. These are the ingredients for a democracy crisis. Leading off our discussion of that crisis tonight is Ari Berman, senior reporter for Mother Jones. He is the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Also joining us, Janae Nelson, Associate Director, Counsel for the NAACP, Legal Defense and Election Fund. And let me begin with you, Janae, tonight, because the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been fighting these battles for as long as the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has existed. This chapter that we've arrived at now, where we are dealing with the aftermath of voting, what Secretary of States will be allowed to do or not be allowed to do, those changes in these election laws are things we've never seen before.
That's right. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been around for 81 years, and we've been fighting attacks on our democracy, and particularly attacks that have used black voters as a vehicle to undermine our democracy and to undermine black political power. That has been something that we've seen time and again, but this particular wave of voter suppression laws seeks to do something even more nefarious than what we've seen in other eras and through other iterations, because it's not only targeting black voters, it is doing that for sure, but it is also targeting our democracy as a whole. It is undermining the machinery of our election administration systems, and it is calling into question the legitimacy of future elections if we allow these laws to stand. It invites partisan interference on a scale that we've never seen before and allows them to overturn legitimate election results and essentially override the will of the voters. And this is happening because we are seeing a change in the demographics of our electorate, and we're seeing voters who have been underrepresented and marginalized exercising their political power in unprecedented ways. It's a deeply unfortunate result that really should be a welcome mat into our democracy, but instead is a slammed door.
Ari, when I read these new laws, they read as if Republican state legislatures want to make sure that there is someone friendly there to take Donald Trump's call when he calls and tells them how many votes he wants them to find.
That's absolutely right, Lawrence. This is the Republican Party's failsafe. They're going to do everything they can to try to make it harder to vote. And if that doesn't work, they are going to be in the positions of power to actually try to overturn or interfere with how votes are counted. And that's the most chilling part of all of this, and the greatest threat to democracy and the greatest threat to democratic norms. We've seen voter suppression before the election. We haven't seen voter suppression after the election. That's what's so new and chilling. And they are trying to accomplish the goal of the insurrection through other means. That because Trump was unable to override the will of the voters, they've done everything they can to try to put themselves in the position in the future to be able to override the will of the voters through the state legislatures, the heavily gerrymandered state legislatures that are doing this, and then laying the groundwork for replacing secretaries of state, replacing members of Congress that might have stood up to Trump in 2020 with people that instead were advocating for Stop the Steal now going forward.
Let's listen to what Stacey Abrams had to say about this.
Voter suppression began with the inception of this nation, but what has happened in the 21st century is that it's been digitized. It's been commoditized, and it's been franchised out of the South and across the country. And what we are seeing with the fake audits, with the intimidation of election workers, with the criminalization of simply doing the job of managing democracy, we are seeing attacks on all levels of our democracy. This is exactly what happens across the world when past long-standing democracies start to erode. It begins by undermining how people feel, not about the democracy that they have, but about the administration of that democracy.
Janae Nelson, I know when Thurgood Marshall was running your legal shop at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, he was accustomed to, when he would gain some yardage and have some wins in this kind of arena, he was accustomed to the opposition finding a new way, finding some other way to block people from voting, always adjusting to whatever progress he was trying to make. And here we are this year with such a sharp and quick reaction to our last vote count that produced a Democratic president. And now it's aimed at a party which is different. It has a different quality and different dimensions to what Thurgood Marshall was fighting.
That's right, but it's, racism is a shapeshifter, and the attempt to monopolize a democracy and at this point really to eliminate this democracy is all part of the same source, which is to maintain a hegemonic power in this country that is centered on white supremacy. Thurgood Marshall knew this to his core. He lauded the work that we did in Brown versus Board of Education, but when asked about his most consequential case, he cited a case from the 1940s, Smith versus Allwright, which was a voting rights case out of Texas, because he knew that the fundamental right to vote was so integral to all the other rights that we fight for. And what we're seeing now is a subversion of all democratic operations in our society. 86 lawsuits were filed to challenge the 2020 elections, and none of them succeeded. So instead of continuing to fight this through fair court processes, you are seeing a single party, unfortunately, enact a rash of laws that subverts all of the processes in our democracy for fair contestation of elections, and is now installing election officials that will do a candidate or a party's bidding at their will. That will lead to anarchy. That is not democracy. That is totalitarianism, and that is something that we must fight with every inch of our being.
Ari, in your article from Mother Jones, you mentioned not just the possibility of what these Republican legislatures are trying to accomplish, but what might happen if we have a Republican Congress. How would that affect the voting outcome?
Well, what would happen is, first off, the gerrymandered state legislatures could decide that they are going to override the will of the voters, actually appoint their own electors as opposed to who the people voted for. That's what Trump wanted. Then it could go to Congress, and Congress could say, we don't have certified electors for the states for Joe Biden, so therefore we are going to appoint or confirm the electors of the gerrymandered legislatures, or we're just going to decide that we're not going to certify the election outcome. And that's the nightmare scenario here, is that the will of the people just becomes completely meaningless, that it's disregarded by gerrymandered legislatures and it's disregarded by the Stop the Steal advocates in the Republican Party at the congressional level. I think this is what this is all building towards, that elections are essentially rendered meaningless because where the Republican Party has power, they're just going to decide that if they don't like the election results, they're not going to abide by them. And that's really the biggest danger here. It's not that people won't be able to get around voter suppression. It's that the ultimate voter suppression, just deciding that people's votes don't matter at all.
Ari Berman and Janae Nelson, thank you very much for joining us tonight on the most important story of the year. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rod.
Thank you. Coming up, the Senate Judiciary Committee wants to see the subpoenas. Democrats. New York Times reported a twist on the Trump subpoena story this weekend, reporting that in 2018, the Trump Justice Department subpoenaed Apple to provide the telephone records of the Trump White House counsel, Don McGahn. Today, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler announced the committee would conduct an investigation into such subpoenas issued by the Trump Justice Department, which also targeted the phone records of two Democratic members of the House Intelligence Committee, Chairman Adam Schiff and Congressman Eric Swalwell. The subpoenas also demanded the phone records of at least one staff member of the House Intelligence Committee and a child. Today, the Democratic members of the Senate Judiciary Committee sent a detailed letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland demanding a copy of each subpoena, all documents and communications, including emails, text messages, and calendar entries related to the subpoenas. Joining us now is Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. He is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee who signed that letter to the Attorney General today. Senator, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. Your letter to the Attorney General gives him 2 weeks to deliver these documents. What happens if he doesn't?
Well, the House can move more or less immediately to a subpoena, and because they have their own members involved, I think they may be willing to do that. We have more complicated subpoena procedures in the Senate at 50-50, but that would be the next stop, is to try to work through our procedures to get a subpoena as well.
As a former prosecutor yourself, do you see any reason why the Attorney General can't simply hand over those documents to you tomorrow?
No, he can. There may be things that would need to be blacked out in order to protect the anonymity of witnesses and things like that. I mean, ordinarily, if you're going to take a run at a member of Congress, you're not going to do so without predication. In fact, the department won't allow you to proceed without predication ordinarily. So you'd lay out the predication somewhere in those memos. And if there were witnesses who gave you that predication, you might want to protect them. So there are reasons to block certain parts of it. But, I mean, a subpoena is usually released to the person who's subpoenaed at the end of the day. So that's certainly not very private. And, the department wants to get a lot of people through the Senate. So if they start playing hardball with us, then, good luck with your nominations.
Well, one position they're going to need to get confirmed is the one being vacated now by a Trump appointee, John Demers, who was apparently an assistant attorney general who may have had control over these subpoenas.
Yeah, well, we have to find that out. It's a little bit strange. I mean, ordinarily, these go before a special committee in the Department of Justice for investigations that touch on serious First Amendment concerns. If you want to run an investigation into a church, if you want to run an investigation into a news outlet, if you want to run an investigation against an elected official, you usually have to get special clearance. And so we'd be looking for the description of how that clearance was obtained, whether this was done as a national security matter within the National Security Division or a criminal matter. There's a lot that has not yet been answered. And one really big question in all of this is the role of the FBI. Ordinarily, these matters go through the FBI, and an FBI agent is directly involved in this. And so Director Wray, I think, has some questions to answer just as much as Barr does and Rosenstein does.
Let's imagine for a second that this information became public the day before Merrick Garland's confirmation hearing. What question would you have asked him about this?
Well, I'd have asked him a question very like the questions that I did ask him, which is, when are you going to open up the Department of Justice to start answering our questions and eliminate the policy we had under the Trump administration of no Democratic questions get answered and politically sensitive Republican questions get a special fast lane out of the FBI.
I want to also get your reaction tonight to Mitch McConnell basically saying if the Republicans get control of the United States Senate, they will not confirm any Biden-chosen Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, the stunning part about that is that he's willing to say it out loud. He might want to have that secret thought with him and his little cabal of elite Republican billionaire donors. But the fact that he's willing to say it out loud shows, first of all, how little respect they have for our ability to tangle with them and take them on for making an admission like that. And second, how just like plain and overt this is. I think he's playing to an audience of a very small group of big billionaire donors who have a plan to try to take over as much control of the United States government as they can. And their target is the Supreme Court. And Mitch will do anything in his power to hand the Supreme Court over as much as he can to that little donor cabal.
Now, he said that based on the possibility of the Republicans winning the Senate through elections in 2022. So that would block 2 years of potential Biden nominations to the Supreme Court. But the truth is, as Senate history shows, the Republicans could conceivably get control of the Senate next week. We have seen plane crashes and other forms of sudden deaths of senators. What I served in the Senate. So we really are at all times a heartbeat away from Republican control. So presumably, if the Republicans got control of the Senate next month, it would apply right now. It would apply for the rest of the Biden presidency. No Supreme Court confirmations.
Look, the most important thing to Mitch McConnell is his little reclusive group of billionaire donors. And the most important thing to them is to control a Supreme Court that doesn't have to answer to the voters, so it will do what they want. And they tell it what to do with this whole little fleet of amici curiae that they send before the court on a regular basis. That is the most important political imperative that Mitch McConnell has. And I believe he will do essentially anything to get there. In fact, we've seen that he broke every possible rule, every norm, every precedent, everything in the Senate that stood in his way, he broke.
Are you hoping that Justice Breyer creates a vacancy on the Supreme Court this summer?
Well, now would be the right time. And if I believed it would do any good to say that, then I'd probably say that. But, you know, you get on the Supreme Court, and you get those robes and you make your own decisions. And I don't know that senators trying to tell you what to do actually makes that decision easier rather than harder.
Well, let's just hope he considers what you just said to have. Let's hope he considers what you just said, that you might say it, but didn't actually say it, even though you did say it. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
We seem to have frozen up.
Thank you, Senator. Coming up, the Reverend William Barber led a Moral Monday for the People Act and asked him to use his power to open up, quote, a new path for justice by ending the use of the filibuster. Joining us now is our Hoppy Kercheval, the Dean of West Virginia Broadcasters and host of the radio program Metro News Talk Line. Also with us, Jonathan Cott. He served as a communications director and senior advisor to Senator Joe Manchin for 7 years. Jonathan, let me start with you since you worked with him every day in the Senate for 7 years. Nancy Pelosi said she read the op-ed and she sees an opening. I read the op-ed and I don't see the opening. Did you see an opening in the op-ed that Nancy Pelosi could get in there and get him to go along with the For the People Act?
I don't think he's going to go along with the For the People Act, but Joe Manchin is always willing to work with anybody, any of his colleagues, Democrats or Republicans. I've seen him in the same week work with Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump. So, yeah, I think you're right. Every politician is optimistic, and Joe Manchin is nothing if he's not a constant optimist who always thinks he can bring people together and get a good bill and a good deal for the people of West Virginia.
Hoppy, what are your radio listeners saying about this? And is Joe Manchin representing their view of this?
Yeah, I think he is, because West Virginia is a conservative state for the most part. Manchin has crafted his political career being in the middle, not getting too far to the left and too far to the right. And I got to tell you, despite this rally today, there's not a lot of buzz on the For the People Act in West Virginia. This is West Virginia's last couple of elections have been very smooth. There haven't been any issues. So that issue isn't getting much traction here. So I'm sure that Manchin, who has great political instincts, feels like he's on the right side for his home state on this.
Jonathan, Joe Manchin keeps saying that he wants bills to be bipartisan, but in this Senate, that means getting 10 Republicans. So far, it looks like maybe he has 5 on what they're calling a framework for an infrastructure bill. It's not clear where the other 5 would come from. Is there a point in this process where Joe Manchin will abandon the attempt at a 60-vote version of the bill?
I don't know if he'll abandon it, but at some point I think he'll realize that no, the Republicans are not willing to come to the table and are not willing to work with him. And he'll try to find a way to work with Senator Schumer and President Biden and craft a bill that he thinks is worthy of 10, 20, 30 Republicans supporting it. If they're not willing to come to the table and work with him, then I think he will find a way to, come to grips with reconciliation and pass a bill that helps West Virginia. I mean, Hoppy knows better than anybody. They need infrastructure in West Virginia. They need roads and bridges. They need internet access. They need, hydro dams, water infrastructure. So he's not going to abandon his state for the sake of bipartisanship, but he wants to work with his Republican colleagues to make sure they get a bill that's good that Shelley Capito thinks is good for West Virginia and Joe Manchin thinks is good for West Virginia.
So, Hoppy, you're giving me the feeling that there probably won't be any movement from Joe Manchin on the voting rights bill, the For the People Act, but on infrastructure, do you agree with Jonathan that if he can't get to 60 Republicans on infrastructure, he has to get some kind of infrastructure to bring back to West Virginia, and he'll do it with Democrats alone if he has to?
I think he will. And remember, he went with reconciliation on the jobs bill a couple of months back. And then he made a big deal out of coming back to West Virginia and saying, I'm bringing millions and millions of dollars to West Virginia counties and cities. He made a point of trying to illustrate that when he did interviews in West Virginia. So he's very aware of the infrastructure needs in West Virginia. He doesn't like all the Green New Deal stuff that's in the Biden plan, but I can very much see Joe Biden making a deal or doing whatever's necessary to get an infrastructure bill that brings back millions to West Virginia, channeling his best memory of Robert C. Byrd.
Jonathan, quickly before we go, what about voting rights? Will there be something on voting rights that Joe Manchin will support and join the Democrats on in the Senate?
Yeah, he supports the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and I would remind you he was Secretary of State and he was governor. He knows how important election integrity is, and he's working hard to make sure that Republicans will come to the table and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and he'll work with anybody to get a better bill, a stronger bill to protect voting rights.
What about the 60-vote threshold on the John Lewis bill?
I don't think Joe Manchin is going to budge on the filibuster. I've known him for a long time, and I've never heard him give an inch on that. I think he's going to do everything he can to get to 60 votes.
Jonathan Lott, Happy Kirschenwald, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And coming up, ProPublica's stunning report last week showed David K. Johnston won the Pulitzer Prize when he was at the New York Times reporting on taxes. He called ProPublica's report on taxes last week the most important tax story that he has ever read. ProPublica took us back to the early days of the tax code when tax returns were not private information and revealed what the top 25 richest Americans pay and mostly don't pay in taxes. Much has been made of the point that apparently the tax avoidance methods used by the billionaires in the article are all legal. In an opinion piece for the New York Times, Anand Giridharadas argues that the problem is not what tax law allows. It's a set of social arrangements that make it possible for anyone to gain and guard and keep so much wealth, even as millions of others lack for food, work, housing, health, connectivity, education, dignity, and the occasion to pursue their happiness. Many Americans are beginning to question not only corruptions of the system, but the matter of whether billionaires should exist at all. Joining us now is Anand Giridharadas, MSNBC political analyst and publisher of the Inc. newsletter. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I was waiting the minute that report came out for what you would be writing about this, and I had some sense of the directions you would go. And in your piece for the New York Times, you point out that it's not really about tax law. There's a much bigger issue to consider here.
Well, what the ProPublica report, which is really heroic journalistic work, what it revealed is that not some kind of epidemic of law breaking, but in fact, a social contract built on madness, an insane social contract in this society in which most of you sitting at home on your sofa or in your bed watching this right now pay a significant portion of your income, a significant portion of the net increase in your wealth year to year to the government. And the richest people, the 25 richest in this case, as is revealed by this report, in many years pay literally zero in income taxes, literally in dollar terms, less than you, not as a proportion of their income. Some of them literally pay less in dollar terms than you. And others pay some amount, but as a fraction of their wealth increase, it's a ridiculous pittance. Warren Buffett's wealth went up $24 billion in the period the story talks about, 2014 to 2018. He paid $24 million in that time. That may sound like real money, but I think a lot of people watching this would love to pay one out of every $1,000 of their net increase in wealth to the government in taxes. Most people spend way higher than that. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we just continue to avoid taxing billionaires' real source of increased money, which is their wealth? not their income. And what anybody who works with billionaires, does accounting, will tell you is that billionaires can literally pick their income for any given year. They can go to their accountant and say, I'd like $1 of income. I'd like losses this year, the way Donald Trump always wanted losses. I'd like my income to be $11 million this year. And things can be rejiggered. They can not sell some things, do whatever they need to do. So it makes no sense to tax billionaires on their income. What we have to start in America getting ready for is taxing billionaires on their wealth.
And Elizabeth Warren has proposed that, and it was considered a radical proposal in the tax world when she first made that case. And every month since then, the case develops in her direction, in her favor. And it seems to me, and on this report, coupled with the richest man in the world deciding to get in his spaceship and go into space, is exactly what Elizabeth Warren needs in terms of pushing her wealth tax. When you have the richest man in the world deciding, I'm going to take my spaceship and go for a ride into space, while you have the homeless population that you have in this country, with nothing being done about it at the same time, those two stories appearing in the same newspapers on the same days, it seems like this is giving Elizabeth Warren some of the momentum she needs.
Look, important conversation starter. Bernie Sanders had a wealth tax also. No shade to either of them. They got an important conversation started, but both of their wealth taxes, neither crossing above the kind of 10% a year of your wealth threshold, neither of those wealth taxes would have actually shrunk these fortunes year to year, right? Because these folks earn returns well above 10%. Typically in a given year, right? So your $1 billion becomes $1.2 billion the next year and so on and so forth. So it's time to actually go beyond the Warren and Sanders tax plans on wealth and really start talking about an erosive wealth tax that would erode these fortunes year to year. So in the year 2022, these biggest fortunes would be smaller than they were in the year